How does a nation made of islands run out of salt? The Philippines has oceans on every side, salt in the air, salt in the soil, and yet today we import nearly all of it, not because the ocean vanished, not because the skill was forgotten, but because of a law passed decades ago that slowly and quietly dismantled a thriving industry. In the 1990s, a nationwide mandate required that all salt sold within the country be iodized in an effort to combat malnutrition. The intention was noble, the consequences were not. Thousands of small-scale salt producers, many using traditional methods handed down through generations, were suddenly in violation of the law. They lacked the machinery to iodize their salt, they lacked the resources to modernize. And so, their salt, once vital to the local economy, was no longer welcome on store shelves. What had once been a livelihood became a liability. What had once been a cultural staple was rebranded as unsafe. Within a few short years, entire regions that once produced salt turned silent. Salt beds dried up, not from lack of seawater, but from lack of use. Imports took over. Mass-produced, industrial salt arrived by the ton from foreign suppliers. It was cheaper, standardized, legally compliant. And so, the country turned away from its own shores, from a product shaped by its climate, its history, its people. Salt, once traded like silver and revered in ritual, became an afterthought, invisible, industrial, forgotten. Yet in a few forgotten corners, the old ways persist. Brine still gathers in hand-carved channels, fires are still lit. Evaporation is still trusted more than machines. In these places, salt isn't just extracted, it's earned. From the sun, from the sea, from time. And in every grain, there's a memory of what was once common, and what may soon be lost entirely. Along certain coastal regions, salt is not harvested, it is crafted. The work begins long before the first crystal forms. It starts with sand, seawater, and patience. Not in factories, but on open beaches scorched by the sun. Fine sand is gathered and filtered, forming the base of a centuries-old process. Seawater is poured through it, allowing the minerals to settle and concentrate. The resulting brine, denser, darker, is collected in containers made not of steel or glass, but of woven materials shaped by tradition. This brine is called by many names. In some places, it's known simply as the essence of salt. Not all batches are equal. The salinity must be just right. And long before digital meters were available, natural tools, sometimes as simple as stones, were used to measure the brine's strength. If it floated, the salt would form. If not, the process would wait. Then comes the fire. The heat must be consistent, not too strong, not too weak. Evaporation takes hours, sometimes entire afternoons, as the water is reduced and impurities are carefully skimmed away. There are no thermostats, no automation, only instinct. Eventually, what remains is not liquid, but solid. Coarse, grainy, white. Salt. Formed not by machines, but by ritual. In some coastal areas, this process continues for days, even weeks, as producers repeat the cycle to extract more than just ordinary salt. What remains from multiple filtrations is collected, dried, and hardened into mineral pillars over time. These towering masses, sometimes shaped like stalagmites, are left to mature in the open air. 3 months of exposure to wind and sunlight produce only a few kilos. But what results is rich in flavor, layered in texture, and deeply symbolic. Often, this hardened salt is grilled or smoked, sometimes softened with local vinegar, to be used as food, especially in times when little else is available. It is both nourishment and memory. And yet, despite the hardship of this method, despite the labor, the time, the uncertainty, it persists. Because to those who continue it, this is more than salt. It is a legacy. It is resistance. It is proof that tradition can still live in the margins of modernity. The younger generations are not always interested. The process is slow, the income modest. But for those who understand its value, abandoning it would mean abandoning part of what it means to belong to the sea, to the land, and to history itself. There are towns once shaped by salt, where entire economies, identities, and lifetimes orbited around the tide. In one such place, salt was once the currency. It covered fields like snow. Children carved names into the drying beds. Elders traded it for bananas, corn, or rice, a barter system as old as the sea itself. At its peak, production reached thousands of sacks per season. Then, everything stopped. The coastline changed. Shorelines retreated under the pressure of climate and concrete. What was once open land became fenced, walled, or washed away. Storms came harder. The sea climbed higher, and the labor, already demanding, became nearly impossible to sustain. Most walked away, not because they wanted to, but because the world around them had made staying too hard. Salt beds dried up, not from sun, but from neglect. What had been communal knowledge was left behind, buried beneath time and sediment. But in rare cases, the tradition was reawakened, sometimes by a proposal, sometimes by memory, sometimes by nothing more than stubborn hope. One such initiative began with just a few women, elders who still remembered the method. Together, they cleared land, filtered seawater, rebuilt structures by hand, and marked their progress with strips of fabric fluttering in the wind, as if to say, "We are still here." They worked with sand, the right kind, cleaned, washed, sun-dried. Brine was filtered through layered beds until it thickened into dense, mineral-rich liquid. Under the right sky, it was poured into drying pans. Too much wind, and the salt scattered. Too little sun, and nothing formed. No manual dictated what to do. Only experience. Only tradition. Harvested crystals were roasted to purify them, a method learned through experimentation and revived through necessity. Each step adapted, not to abandon tradition, but to carry it forward. The salt they produced was not just food. It was a second chance, a quiet defiance against forgetting. And while neighboring regions had gone silent, the flags here still waved. The salt beds breathed. People began to return, not many, but enough. Even now, in some places, the barter system endures. Salt for bananas, salt for root vegetables. No receipts, no currency, just exchange. Not as nostalgia, but as for survival. Because for those who rebuild these beds, the question isn't why continue. It's what happens if no one does. Not all salt is white. Not all salt is soft. Some of it looks like stone. Dark, heavy, charred on the outside, but inside, rich veins of flavor no laboratory could reproduce. This is salt born of fire, not evaporated by sun or wind, but forged in heat, layered with smoke and hardened like brick. The process begins with driftwood. Not just any wood, only those pieces carried by the sea and soaked in salt water for months. When burned, this wood becomes ash soaked with minerals, just as valuable as the salt itself. The ash is collected, sifted, and packed tightly into woven baskets. Seawater is poured through it over and over, dripping down into a container below. The result? A deep, concentrated brine, dense with salt and memory. But the transformation doesn't stop there. Into this brine goes a secret ingredient, fresh coconut milk. The mixture simmers in a wide, shallow pan, slowly, carefully, for hours. There are no thermometers, no timers, only instinct. Families gather around the fire, each person tending, stirring, adjusting. The liquid thickens, the smoke rises, and eventually, what remains is poured and pressed into molds, forming dark, solid blocks of salt. Each block, sometimes called a brick, can last for months. It's grated, broken, shaved, and eaten in slivers. Its flavor? Smoky, earthy, haunting. A taste of labor, fire, and the ocean's patience. But the salt itself is only half the story. There were times it couldn't be made. Oil spills poisoned the water, explosions blackened the shore, pandemics halted everything. Years passed. The pits went cold. The ash gathered dust. And yet, the memory didn't vanish. It waited until hands returned to rebuild the fires, until someone said, "We begin again." Today, the tradition lives not because it's easy or profitable, but because it still matters. Because it reminds people where they come from. Because in each grain, there's a quiet defiance against forgetting. This isn't just salt, it's proof that even after disaster, some things still survive. Shaped like an ancient egg, heavy, fragile, coated in ash, this salt doesn't glisten, it waits. Quiet, hardened. Its name once meant unbroken, its shape tells you why. This is salt that begins not in the sea, but in the husk of a coconut. Thousands of them soaked in brine and left to ferment under the tropical sun. They absorb the salt like a sponge, then they're burned. For days, fires roar. The husks collapse into ash, flavored by smoke, thyme, and sea. This ash becomes the foundation. It's carefully packed into natural filters made of rattan and palm leaves. And then, the waiting begins. Seawater is poured, slowly through the ash, drop by drop. What comes out is no longer seawater, it's tussock, a dark mineral-rich concentrate. Thick, potent, alive. But the most delicate step is still ahead, the fire. Clay pots, hand-formed and sun-dried, are filled with the liquid. They're balanced above open flames, heated by wood and fronds. The pots must endure hours of steady, rising heat. Inside, the salt begins to crystallize, forming layer upon layer, fusing into a single solid form. No one stirs, no one adds anything. They wait. And when the pot cracks, it's ready. Inside, a dome of salt, smooth, dense, ancient in its silence. Each pot yields just one chance, one block. This isn't seasoning, this is a ritual. This is what happens when time and patience are more important than scale or speed. For decades, this method disappeared. Natural disasters destroyed workshops. Laws made traditional salt illegal. People left. But the craft was never truly lost. It was remembered, in whispers, in recipes, in stories. And eventually it returned, not with machines or mass production, but with bare hands, dried husks, and a belief that not everything old should be forgotten. This salt carries the flavor of earth, smoke, and memory. A full year pressed into a single lump. And though few have tasted it, those who do never forget. Once, salt in the Philippines was everywhere. Harvested from coast to coast, from Pangasinan to Cavite. From Mindoro to Bulacan, entire communities lived by the tides. They didn't need imports. They didn't need permission. They simply made salt. Then, in 1995, everything changed. A law was passed, meant to fight iodine deficiency. It sounded reasonable. All salt must be iodized. Good for health. Good on paper. But it wasn't written for the people who still made salt with sun, brine, and fire. It didn't account for wooden beds and bamboo filters. For fire pits instead of factories. No budget, no training, no transition plan. Overnight, traditional salt became illegal. Not because it was unsafe, but because it couldn't be chemically altered. What followed was quiet collapse. Salt beds dried up, not from sun, but from silence. Communities abandoned their craft. Markets turned to imports, cheap, fast, approved. Salt was no longer seen as heritage. It was now just another commodity, imported from China, Australia, Mexico. Today, less than 10% of the salt consumed in the Philippines is made locally. But what truly disappeared wasn't just an industry. It was a worldview. Salt had once meant barter. It had once meant survival. Now, it meant regulation, paperwork, fines. And all across the archipelago, traditions that had lasted centuries vanished in a single generation. A law meant to solve one problem quietly created many more. For nearly 3 decades, the regulation remained untouched, a forgotten line of policy that reshaped an entire culture silently. But on the fringes, something endured. The law didn't erase memory. It didn't erase hands that still knew how to gather sand, test brine, or read the sky. Across salt flats and coastal villages, a quiet resistance took root. No protests, no headlines, just continued work. Slow, sacred, unseen. And eventually, change stirred. In 2023, a bill was passed to amend the original law, a new chapter, one that recognized the difference between industrial production and ancestral tradition. The amendment proposed what should have always existed: legal space for artisanal salt, support for natural methods, training, infrastructure, respect. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. Some regions began installing shared iodine facilities, allowing traditional salt makers to comply without altering centuries-old techniques. Others formed cooperatives to pool knowledge, tools, and access to markets. Universities got involved. Restaurants began sourcing locally again. In places once thought forgotten, salt beds were cleared. Evaporated crusts reappeared. Smoke rose again from coastal fires. The work was still hard. The money is still modest. But something was returning, a sense of continuity. Because behind every grain of traditional salt, it is a decision to remember, to preserve. This wasn't nostalgia, it was resistance. It was cultural preservation disguised as everyday labor. Salt is the simplest thing. You don't notice it until it's missing, but in that absence, something larger disappears too. Because salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was survival. It was a language, spoken through fire, tide, and touch. A way of understanding the ocean, a way of living with it, not against it. When it vanished from store shelves, it also vanished from memory, from kitchens, from conversations, from identity. Most have never seen a true salt bed, never felt coarse crystals scraped fresh from the earth, never tasted the richness of sun-dried brine, cooked over driftwood, filtered through ash and time. And yet, somewhere in the quiet corners of the archipelago, it still happens. Someone still lights the fire, still pours seawater into hand-dug beds, still watches for the wind. Not for tourists, not for trend, but because it's what remains. And maybe that's the lesson. What disappears in silence can also return the same way. One decision. What small act, what question asked at dinner? Where does our salt come from? What was lost was never just industry. It was knowledge, craft, pride, and perhaps a better way of thinking about food, time, and what deserves to last. The salt beds still exist, the tide still comes in, the sun still dries the earth, and hands, a few hands, still remember. So the question now isn't how it was made, or even why it vanished. Salt was never just about flavor. It was about place. About rhythm. About a people who once turned ocean into sustenance with nothing more than sun, wind, and memory. For generations, it shaped how communities worked, bartered, and survived. And when it disappeared, it left more than an empty shelf. It left a silence. A rupture in the story of who we are. But tradition doesn't vanish all at once. It fades when no one speaks of it. It dies when no one asks where things come from. And it survives, not in museums, but in conversations, in choices, in care. This isn't about longing for the past. It's about deciding what deserves a future. So next time you reach for salt, ask yourself, do you know its story? And more importantly, is it worth remembering?